questions we have today are, why are there two testaments? Which, for some of you who've been in the church forever, you might be like, oh, that's an easy one. But some of you, if you haven't been in the church forever, if you went to a church and just assumed you knew everything, never, taught you, you'd be like, yeah, that is kind of weird. There's an old one and a new one, but I don't know what that's supposed to mean. Second one, a little bit more in depth. How did we get the Bible that we have? Why do we leave some books out? Because there's other books out there, right? I mean, do a quick Google search and you'll find someone really angry on the internet because we should have the Gospel of Thomas in there. Why is the Gospel of Thomas not in there, right? So let's answer that question, at least give you a little bit of a baseline to work with. And then our last question today is going to be, can we trust the Bible? And that's actually a really big question, but I just want to give you some basic skills to work with so that you can kind of start exploring that on your own. The Bible is a pretty big book, and it covers a lot of history, and it has a lot of extraordinary claims. So I just want to give you kind of a foundation that you can start building on, right? If I'm the source of all of your Bible knowledge, you're in trouble. So I want you guys to be able to explore on your own, because frankly, what I can get up here on stage is a tiny fraction, 5% of what I'm reading and what I'm listening to. I just don't have that much time with you every week. So if this is your only source of Bible knowledge, if this is your only source of information on Scripture, it's just not enough. So I want to give you the skills to go out and learn on your own, right? And then you can come back and you can argue with me, and then we can learn together, and that's what churches should look like. So why are there two testaments? What is a testament, for that matter? Let's start answering that question. First of all, does anyone know what that word testament, what language it comes from? It's not an English word. You want to guess? We're thinking like fancy academic terms. What language is it always? People don't speak it anymore. It was really popular in Italy a long time ago. What? Latin. Yeah, it's Latin. Testamentum. I'm probably mispronouncing that. Someone took a Latin class. I apologize. It literally means covenant. Now, that word sounds familiar to church people, right? Covenant, we hear that from time to time. It's kind of like a contract, but a specific kind of contract. Biblically, when we're talking about covenants, we're talking about a suzerain treaty. I know that sounds really foreign, so let me explain it. The way that a suzerain treaty normally worked is a contract between a larger, more powerful nation, normally, and a less powerful one. So an empire, like, say, the Babylonian Empire, may come to someone, to a smaller nation, and say, you have a couple of choices, buddy. You can give me your lunch money, or I can beat you up and take your lunch money. And part of this process is they'd give them this treaty, this suzerain treaty, that basically says, you have these responsibilities. Normally, in times of war, you'll give us this many soldiers as a levy. In times of peace, you'll give us this much of a tax. And in return, we'll keep up on your roads, basically do the thing the government does, right? Take care of public resources. We'll protect you from larger nations. We'll represent you in economic, when you're negotiating trade agreements or something like that. So basically, it's this sort of, you're kind of independent, but you're also kind of under our banner treaty. The key to a suzerain treaty is that there is a larger power that dictates the terms, and the smaller power can either say yes or get forced to say yes. And the covenants that God makes with people usually resemble a suzerain treaty. Now, the funny thing is, he does actually seem to let people opt out. Once people opt in, they're opted in. And normally when they opt in for their children, their children's children, and their children's children. But the structure of these covenants, God is the more powerful party. He goes to this weaker party, to humankind, and says, here are the terms. And that weaker party has no right to say, well, I like points A and B where you take care of me, but I don't like that third part where I have responsibilities. You're not allowed to do that. The more powerful party is the one that dictates the terms. It's called a suzerain treaty. So when we see this, you can see why translators didn't say the old suzerain treaty and books related to it, and the new suzerain treaty and books related to it, because that gets really wordy. There's a little bit more to why we have Testament instead that has to do with how the church really liked Latin for a while, but it's not super important for our purposes today. But it is helpful to keep that rule in the back of your mind, that when you read Old Testament, it's the old contract, the books that were written under this contract that is no longer in effect. And the New Testament are the books written under the new contract. So let's get into that a little bit more. Jesus is kind of the reason why there is this switch. If you need a shorthand Jesus was kind of the reason why we had to get rid of the old contract and come to the new. That's a little bit of an oversimplification. So again, we can get into this a little bit deeper. Now, in case any of you have been confused this entire time, you're going Old Testament, New Testament, I haven't opened a Bible in 45 years, and I don't know what he's talking about. If you read out all the books that you find in a Protestant Bible, and yes, Protestant Bibles are a little different than Catholic Bibles. We'll get into that in a minute. These are the books that you'll have. There's 66 total. There's 39 in the Old Testament, and there's 27 in the New Testament. Easy enough, right? These Old Testament books here, these old contract books, when we're reading them, we have to remember these weren't written specifically to us. Now, these ones weren't either, but they're a little closer. The context is a little closer for the New Testament than it is for the Old. Here's what we mean. When we're talking about this Old Testament, this old collection of books, they're written by prophets to the people of God under the Mosaic and Abrahamic covenants, testaments, suzerain treaties. There are these old contracts that God made with a guy named Abraham and then a guy named Moses and all of their family members, what we call the nation of Israel. And all of those 39 books were written specifically to those people. In other words, they weren't written directly to us. Let's look at some scripture so you don't just have to take my word for it. These books were written by prophets. One example of this is in Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 1 and 4, where Jeremiah, or actually his scribe Baruch, writing on his behalf, says these words. The words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, one of the priests to Anathoth in the territory of Benjamin. A few verses later, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, and then he goes on, he issues what's called an oracle, a message from God. A prophet is any person who hears from God with a message for other people. That is the definition that Jewish people worked with. That's the definition the Bible works with. So if I think God's speaking to me, but that's it, I just think he's speaking to me, that doesn't make me a prophet. It makes me lucky. If God speaks to me and says, Jason, I have something you need to go tell Ben, that would make me a prophet. And that's scary. That's scary because in the New Testament, if a prophet issues an oracle that is wrong, he should be kicked out of the church, which is a little terrifying. If we lived a couple thousand years ago and we were good Jewish people, it'd be even scarier, because what happens to a false prophet in the Old Testament? They die. You throw heavy rocks at them until they die, because they're dangerous not only to the religious community, they could destroy the nation. It's treason, essentially, to be a false prophet. So you better be really sure when Jesus is speaking, when God is speaking to you. Jeremiah here is saying, the word of the Lord came to me. He's saying, God spoke to me. He's claiming for himself the title of prophet, which means if anything that he says is false, he should be executed. It's a dangerous profession. And actually, most prophets, the good ones, the ones who didn't say anything false, they ended up getting executed anyways because people didn't like what they said. It's a dangerous profession. But these Old Testament books, every single one of them was written by a prophet or written by one of their scribes on behalf of them. At the end of the book of Jeremiah, you see a little note from this guy named Baruch, who basically says, like, these are all the teachings of Jeremiah, and I collected them on his behalf. So these are Jeremiah's words, but someone else actually put pen to paper and wrote them on his behalf. That's fine. All these books were essentially authored by prophets. What about Genesis? Who wrote that? We don't technically know, but the oldest tradition is that Moses did. Moses was a prophet. He spoke with God face to face. Same with Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, all of the Torah. The oldest tradition is Moses. But then there's this funny thing that happens in some of the books where there's things that somebody couldn't have possibly written. We're not even talking about prophecy, because I accept that miracles are possible and have happened. But at the end of Numbers, there's this chunk that's written that is clearly written after Moses died, because it's written about his death and what happened after he died. So Moses wrote Numbers, but part of it is written after his death. How does that work? He didn't write the end of it. Who did? Probably Joshua, his protege, who was also a prophet who spoke with God directly and had messages for the people. You see how this works? The Old Testament was written by a collection of prophets. Some books were written by entire communities of prophets over extended periods of time. Is that okay? It is. God reveals his truth how he reveals his truth. Some of them are actually the teachings of prophets. They're written down by a scribe, but it's still the prophet's words. Is that okay? Yes. The book of Jeremiah tells us explicitly. So if you have a problem with Jeremiah, take it up with him. Take it up with the big guy, not me. Right? They're written by prophets. They're written to the nation of Israel, Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 7. This is part of a very famous Jewish prayer. It's a lovely prayer. You should try praying it. It's an amazing, beautiful prayer for Christians as well. And listen to the words. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength. Someone repeats that in New Testament. Oh, who was it? Jesus. Yeah, Jesus repeats that. Heart, soul, mind, strength. He adds a little bit to it. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. These commandments I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road and when you lie down and when you get up. And the Shema goes on just a little bit longer than that. The word Shema means hear, which is that first word. It's a command. Hear, listen. You know, like when your kid's misbehaving, you're like, hey, listen. Right? You've all done that. Don't lie. You have. If you haven't, you will. I do it with my dogs. That kind of counts. Hear, oh, who? Israel. Who? Israel. Murfreesboro? Carbondale. St. Louis? Israel. Israel. Who is this written to? Israel. Not to us. Is it still useful to us? Yeah, but it's not written to us. This is written to God's people under the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, the Old Suzerain Treaty. The two that don't apply anymore. The two that have been fulfilled. The two that have run their course and are completed. These are the technical documents, the policies to an old nonprofit organization that has been dismantled and replaced by a new one, right? Kind of get what I'm saying. That was a metaphor, if anyone didn't pick that up. Yeah, these weren't written to us. They were written by prophets to the nation of Israel under old contracts that are not in effect anymore. That's really important for us to grasp. So that's why we have the Old Testament. And it's still useful. You know how I know it's still useful? Because Jesus quotes it a lot. A lot. And when he's not quoting it, he's paraphrasing it. And when he's not paraphrasing it, he's alluding to it. Someone comes to him and says, what is the greatest commandment? He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind. He adds that one, and strength. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do you remember what he says right after that? It's part of the same quote. He doesn't even take a breath. He just keeps going. He says, these commandments sum up all the law and the prophets, which is a very Jewish way of saying the Old Testament. The law and the prophets, or sometimes they say the law, the prophets, and the writings. This is how they divided their scriptures up. Okay? Jesus uses it. It's still helpful. Paul uses it too. One of a preacher's favorite verse, where he's telling the church that you should pay your preachers. He says, that's kind of a joke. Anyways, he's writing to his protege, Timothy, and he's encouraging him. He's saying, look, the people who teach in your congregation, they should be rewarded. And you know what he does? He quotes the Old Testament. He quotes a really weird verse. Do not muzzle an ox while it is threshing. Why do oxen work? Because you make them, and because you feed them. Their pay is their food and where they get to sleep, right? As it were. And so Paul kind of used the Old Testament as an illustration. Look, even an ox, you'd pay an ox, you'd let it eat while it's working. It's earned its keep, hasn't it? Shouldn't you do the same with your teachers? He appeals to the Old Testament to make a point to the church. The Old Testament is still immensely helpful. We don't forget about it. We have to remember it's not written to us. Now we're going to speed up a little bit. It's just that's really important for us to hit. See, when God wrote those old suzerain treaties, he intended to write a new one. He always knew those old ones would not be sufficient for all time. They served a purpose temporarily, but they were just preparing the way. We see this in a lot of places, but one of them is Jeremiah 31, which is part of the Old Testament. He wrote this before there was a new contract. He says this, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant, a new contract with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah, and it will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand and led them out of Egypt. That's the Mosaic covenant he's alluding to there. Because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them. And then the end there, it's cut off, says, declares the Lord. I will make a new covenant. If we really like Latin, a new testament. If we really like technical language, a new suzerain treaty. I'm going to make a new contract with you. God promises that, even under the old covenant. So God intended to give us a new covenant. And when he does, he needs to give us some books to explain how to live under it. And that's where we get the New Testament. These are written to churches, not to us. They're written to churches living under the same contract you and I live under. They're a little bit closer. They're a little bit easier to empathize with than maybe the Old Testament is. First of all, they're written by apostles, people who walked with Jesus, the closest followers of Jesus, those who had actually witnessed his ministry and heard his teachings. One place where we see this pointed out is Ephesians chapter 1, where Paul identifies himself as an apostle. Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, or Christ Jesus, by the will of God to God's holy people, some messages say in Ephesus, to the faithful in Christ Jesus. Paul is an apostle. He's an apostle. What's an apostle? Early on in Acts, I'm going to put someone on the spot here. Early on in the book of Acts, they have a problem because there was 12 apostles to begin with, 12 like special chosen disciples of Jesus, and one of them betrayed them and then committed suicide. So they couldn't even restore him if they wanted to. He's gone. He's dead. So they have 11. They want one more. They think it's important for there to be 12 because there's symbolism between the 12 apostles and 12 tribes of Israel. And they choose a guy named Matthias, and they have 2 requirements for him. It's implied that this is a leadership position, but before they grant him this leadership position, before they name him the 12th apostle, they have 2 requirements for him. Mitch, do you know what it is? You're my Bible college nerd. Do you remember them? No? That he's male and witnessed the ministry of Jesus. They actually come down to 2 different guys, and then they cast lots to decide which one because they're both qualified. So those are the requirements for an apostle. An apostle is an implied leadership position. We see this throughout the New Testament. When an apostle speaks, even the elders of the church have to listen to him. And their requirements, at least in Acts, are that he's male and that he witnessed the ministry of Jesus. There's a couple reasons why they might have wanted him to be male. We won't get into that today because it's just a message for a different time. But there's a couple different interpretations of that one, but the second one is really important, that he witnessed the ministry of Jesus. There's actually a lot of apostles named in the New Testament outside of the 12. The 12 seem to have like a special leadership position, but there are others named. In fact, there's actually a woman named at one point, which obviously makes the whole he has to be male thing really complicated. Her name is Junia. She's named in Romans. But there are others. Apollos is called an apostle at one point, and Andronicus, I believe is the name, is named with Junia in the book of Romans. And there's a few others. I think the total count is somewhere in the 20s. So there's like the 12 apostles. But then there's like all these other people too that get thrown in because they witnessed the ministry of Jesus. Paul is a really weird case because he didn't witness it face to face, or if he did, it was as an enemy. But eventually he's commissioned by Jesus. Jesus actually gives him a vision, appears to him on the road to Damascus, and commissions him to be an apostle. So apostles are leaders in the church who may or may not have had to be male. In most cases, they were regardless. And they had witnessed the ministry of Jesus, and their job was to establish churches and witness to the truth of the gospel and to defend the faith. And the books of the New Testament are written by apostles, except for the ones that aren't. Yeah, it's never easy, is it? Like the book of Luke. Luke wasn't an apostle, but he still wrote, actually, word-wise, more than any other author in the New Testament. He only wrote 2 books, but they're really long books. He probably preached like I do. He just keeps going. The thing is, he was an associate of the apostles. We see this in Acts chapter 16, where Luke writes this. After Paul had seen the vision, he received a vision from God of a man from Macedonia. After Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once. Wait. We got ready at once. Up to this point, it was Paul and Barnabas, Peter, John, all these other guys, I'm going to tell you about all these apostles are doing. And then in chapter 16, he says, we got ready at once. Who's with Paul? Luke, the guy who's writing the book. Luke's with him. Luke traveled with Paul. What do you think they talked about while they were around the campfire, while they were walking on the road, while they were on a boat floating around the Mediterranean Sea? Probably told stories, probably told jokes, probably talked about the churches they'd worked in. Paul probably taught Luke the things that the other apostles had taught him, I would assume. And Luke's fun, too, because Luke travels all over, so what other apostles might he have met on his way? What other apostles might he have met through Paul? We know Paul ran into Peter at Galatia. Was Luke with him? Maybe. If so, Luke doesn't mention it. Could Luke have been at the Jerusalem Council and maybe seen all of the living apostles together in one place? He maybe could have But at the very least, we know for sure he traveled with Paul. He's a close associate of the apostles, at least one of them. He received teaching from the apostles. And when he writes, he's writing down the story of the apostles. So some of the books in the New Testament are written by apostles. They're written by very close associates, people like Luke. Or another one is Mark. John Mark. He has two names because, like Latin families, they just really liked having way too many names. Right, Ben? Yeah. And Mark's really fun because he knew Paul. He knew Barnabas. Barnabas was his cousin, who was also named an apostle by Paul. That's interesting. There's also a pretty good chance he shows up in the Gospel of Mark, and it's like one of my favorite passages ever, but it's also like kind of moderately inappropriate because he's not clothed. But he also doesn't name himself, so we're kind of guessing there. A lot of you are like, what on earth are you talking about? Go back and read the account of Jesus' arrest in the Gospel of Mark. A naked dude shows up, and I bet most of you didn't know that because you read right over. It's one quick little verse where there's a guy hiding in some bushes, someone grabs his cloak, and then he's like, and he runs away naked. That might be Mark, but we aren't entirely sure. Regardless, we're pretty sure that Mark followed Jesus from the earliest days, so maybe he even qualified as an apostle. I don't think he's ever named one. But Mark writes one, at least the Gospel of Mark, and we can go through all the books and see where apostles or associated apostles wrote all of these books. The New Testament is written by the associates of apostles. Romans 1:7, they're written to the churches. To all in Rome. To all where? Rome. To all where? In Murfreesboro? In St. Louis? No, in Rome. To all in Rome who are loved by God and called to be his holy people, grace and peace to you from God our Father and from the Lord Jesus Christ. It is written to the churches living under the same contract that we are living under. Slightly different context, but a lot closer than the Old Testament is. So where do we get the Old Testament from? Books written under the old contract. Still helpful, they don't apply the way they used to. The New Testament under the new contract. Explanation from the apostles and their associates for how we and people before us were to live under the new contract. Now, why did we decide to put the books in that we put in? Ooh, this one's going to be fun. We're going to have to speed up a lot. Why did we leave books out? Why is the Gospel of Thomas not in my Bible? Why are there books in the Catholic Bible that aren't in my Bible? Ooh, that one's going to get sticky. Let's go. We're going to have to talk about canons. That kind. C-A-N-N-O-N is the kind that goes boom. C-A-N-O-N literally means a stick. But normally is used to refer to collections of holy texts like this. We're talking about canons. So the Old Testament canon and the New Testament canon have a slightly different story, and we're going to go through them really, really quickly. Am I talking too fast for you? Slow down just a little bit. The Old Testament canon for Protestants is the same as the Hebrew Bible. That's basically the story. We copied the Hebrew Bible. We changed the order slightly. We put the books in a slightly different order, but that's more of a cultural thing than anything. I wouldn't quite divide. I mean, the Old Testament's fine here. It's arranged 5, 12, 5, 5, 12. Law, history, wisdom, major prophets, minor prophets. New Testament, I don't quite like how this illustration arranges them, but it's close enough. But the Old Testament, we basically just copied the Hebrew Bible, put them in a slightly different order, and moved on with our days. So why is it the Catholic Bible has different books? Well, early on in the church, there was a couple people who called them the church fathers, the patristic fathers, which is really strange because patristic is like of or related to father, so it's the fathers, which is, anyways. The patristic fathers, well, they looked at these collections of books they collected from the apostles, and one might have a few books and one might have a few books, and it was really hard, they didn't have printing presses. It was really hard to get the books all over the place. And they start coming up with these lists of books that they should use. In the New Testament, we'll get into that a little bit more because those lists got a little more complicated. But with the Old Testament, they pretty much said, hey, we're going to use the same books that the Jews used because those are the books that Jesus used. Makes sense, right? Pretty sound logic. If it was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for us. But they found a few other books, some of which were actually written after Jesus' lifetime, that they were like, well, they're true. What's said in them is true, and they're really helpful, so we'll add those in. Books like Tobit. Now, whether or not these books are historically factual is a different issue, but the lessons contained in them aren't anything crazy. Like, they aren't. You can go and read them. I've read some, not all of them. And there's nothing super insane in them as far as doctrine goes. They're pretty standard Jewish Christian books. So these early church fathers took those and said, well, they're helpful, so we'll go ahead and add those in. And by about 300 AD, I guarantee you, if you dig enough, you'll find someone that says, well, the Christians didn't even have a canon until 1500s in the Council of Trent, and that is not true. There's a series of synods and councils, one in Florence, one in North Africa, a few others I can't remember off the top of my head, in the 300s, where they basically said, this is the list of books that we're using. It's the Old Testament Jesus used, plus a couple of extra ones, like Tobit, a little extra in Daniel, a little extra in Esther, a few others. And so they settled, and they said, we're going to agree on this list, but we don't want to cause any fights, so we're not going to demand everyone use this list. We're just going to very strongly recommend it, right? When your boss says, I'm not going to require you to do that, but I very strongly recommend it. What does that mean? It means you have to do it. Yeah, and that's what they did. So in the 300s, the canon was already settled, and it took them about 1,200 years to finally say, no, we're just making it a rule now. We'll get to that in a minute. So 1,100 years later, in the 1400s, there's this guy named Martin Luther. He got really mad. He wrote a really long paper, and he nailed it to a door on a church in Wittenberg, Germany. We call it the Protestant Reformation. He was trying to reform the Catholic Church. Catholic Church said, we don't need reforming. We don't like you. He said, I don't like you. They got into a big fight, and that's where we get Protestant churches from. Ish. Martin Luther looked at the Old Testament. He said, we added a bunch of books that Jesus didn't use. I don't want them. And so he took out the books like Tobit and the additions of Daniel, and he tried to get back to just the books that Jewish people used, just the books that Jesus would have used. That's where we get our Protestant Old Testament from. The Catholics, about 100 years later, said, well, we really like those books, and they're not wrong, so we're going to keep them. That's when you have the Council of Trent. That's why they have extra books in the Old Testament. Whew! You're tracking with that. Okay. Now, again, those books don't teach anything super crazy. There's one little weird thing in 2 Maccabees that is where the doctrine of purgatory comes from. Different issue for a different day. Probably not a sermon, but like a Devo or something. But it's not anything super insane, so I don't worry about it too much. But that's why we use the books that we use and why I'm very comfortable using the books that we use and not the ones that the Catholic Church uses. But I'm also not like banging on the door of the Catholic Church like, you heretics, because it's not as big of an issue as it seems. Also, if you have time, read the books. They're really interesting. Like, legitimately, they are. Go buy it's called an Apocrypha. Go buy an Apocrypha and read it. It's really interesting. So that's how we got our Old Testament. How do we get our New Testament? It starts off with a heretic, as all good stories do. His name was Marcion. He was a Gnostic, which means he believes that he had secret knowledge that made him like more holy than everyone else around him. We've met some people like that. Beside the point, he came up with a really short list with some of Paul's works and then the Gospel of Luke with a bunch of chunks that he took out of it. It's called Marcion's Gospel, and you can look it up and read it. It's literally the Gospel of Luke with a bunch of stuff taken out that he didn't like. And then he published it. It's called Marcion's Canon or Marcion's List. And then a bunch of other people that disagreed with him went, first of all, you're a heretic. Second of all, no. And they came up with their own lists. And by about 300, they kind of settled on the same list, the list that we have today. There's a little bit of variation. If you go into Eastern churches, I think like the book of Hebrews and either Jude or Revelation. I'm not super familiar with Eastern churches, so don't fact check me. Don't take me at my word on this. But there's a few books in certain Eastern churches that aren't included, which is strange to us. But in the Western world, at least, we settled on these 27 books. And then even when the Protestant Reformation happened, the books didn't change. Martin Luther and his buddies did not have an issue with them, so the Catholic New Testament and the Protestant New Testament are the exact same. Now, they didn't just pick these names out of a hat. They actually had 3 tests that they used: authorship, agreement, and acceptance. So when they're doing these councils in the 300s and they're getting together and everyone has their own lists and they're comparing and contrasting and they're taking books out and they're adding books in, these are the 3 tests. If you didn't pass the 3 tests, you didn't make it. Let's explain these a little bit. Authorship, who wrote it? Was it an apostle or a close associate of an apostle? If yes, you pass the test. If not, chucking you out. There's an awesome book called the Didache that is based on the teachings of the apostles, but we don't know who wrote it. It is a super cool book. You should read it. It's also super short. It's basically like the first catechism ever written by the church. Super cool. But it's not in the Bible. We don't know who wrote it. And some churches didn't agree to accept it. That's actually point 2. Do all the churches, point number 3, acceptance. Point number 2 is agreement. Agreement is, does it agree with the books that we agree should be in? 2 + 2 = 4. If I come up with an equation and it looks super complicated and super cool and you really like it, but at the end, once you solve everything down, it says 2 + 2 = 5, is my equation right? No. In the same way, if we have a book and we know that a certain book is true, so we have a book like Matthew that no one's arguing about, and we know that Matthew is true, if I come up with another book like the Gospel of Thomas, that mysteriously appears 500 years after all the other books. Wonder how that happens. And I say, look at this. Look how Jesus like murders his friends and brings birds back to life. Those are actual stories in the Gospel of Thomas. It is a wild ride. And someone reads that and says, Jesus murdering his friends doesn't seem to be in keeping with the Jesus we read about in Matthew. Do we include that book? Because it contradicts the ones that we really, really trust. No. It contradicts what we know to be true, so we can't include it. The other issue with the Gospel of Thomas is it wasn't written by Thomas. We have no idea who wrote it, and it was written way, 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 way later than the other Gospels. So we have a lot of reasons to not include it, but that's how agreement works. Does it agree with the other texts that we really trust? So we have like the A1 text that no one's arguing about. If a text disagrees with them, it doesn't go in the Bible. It might be helpful, but it doesn't go in the Bible. Third is acceptance. Do all the churches agree to include it? So when they're doing these councils, they'd literally get together and they'd vote. They'd say, hey, yeah, I'm in favor, or I abstain, or whatever. And if churches, especially major churches, do not agree, if the church in Jerusalem was like, yeah, we can't include the Didache. We can't include it. We just can't. Like, it's a great book, but we just shouldn't include it. Then you don't include it. So the churches had to agree, at least the major churches, Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, Rome, a few others, they had to agree to include the books or they didn't get included. So that's the three: authorship, agreement, and acceptance. In other words, there was a logical process to actually determine what books ended up in the New Testament. It wasn't random. And some opponents of Christianity will say, oh, it was totally random. They had no good reason. That's a lie. It's just a blatant, bald-faced lie. There was good reason. They had a whole method. And they did it fairly quickly, too. So the people who were disciples of the apostles had either had input at the beginning of the process, or by the time these councils came around to the 300s, it was students of people who were students of the apostles, students of people like Clement of Rome that had good firsthand, secondhand knowledge of teachings from people like the gospel or the apostle John that could feed into this and say, yeah, John would have taught that, John wouldn't have taught that, so we should exclude that book. There was a whole process, and we ended up with the New Testament. Now, I'm running, or about to run, a little long. I have 3 minutes, and this is a very big question. Can we trust the Bible? So we're going to sprint through this very, very, very quickly, because there's basically just two ways that I want to approach this question. It's just a bedrock, just a foundation, and you build on it on your own, okay? Because I can't answer this question. I could take 6 months and not answer this question fully. The first one is treat the Bible like any other historical document. If you don't think you can trust it, treat it like any other historical document. Go in and ask the questions you would ask of any other book. Are there any other sources that corroborate these claims? Is there any archaeological evidence? Are there any other sources that contradict this document? What are the biases of the author? Is there anyone outside, any external biases? Is there like a king looking over his shoulder who's going to behead him if he doesn't say certain things? Are there any details that are hard to explain if they're untrue? For example, in the Gospels, why are women in a very patriarchal society the first people to hear that Jesus was alive? That would have been really embarrassing for Christians. If it's not true, why would you include that detail? If you're making it up, it would be really easy to say, yeah, James and Peter, sure, yeah, those guys found. That's not what happens. So why would they include that detail? You have to ask these questions and then weigh the evidence. Treat it like any other historical document. If you want to do this, a really great book to start with, especially when it comes to the death and resurrection of Jesus, is A Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. There's a few other books I could recommend, but that's a really easy, approachable one, a good place to start. But please keep going past it as well. Second of all, miracles can provide proof. If there's any provable miracles or miracles that maybe we can lend a lot of evidence to, one would be the resurrection of Jesus. That provides a lot of support for Scripture. If there's a miracle or a prophecy or something in Scripture that we can look at and say, wow, it's really likely this actually happened, that lends a lot of credence to it, right? If I wrote a book that predicted something that was going to happen in 300 years, and 300 years later that thing happened, you'd look at at me and be like, wow, he was a genius. He knew some things that other people didn't know, right? Like, that would be wild. So if the Bible does stuff like that, if it predicts something hundreds of years in advance, maybe there's something there. Let me give you just one quick example. On the cross, Jesus shouts out this really famous phrase. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? If you're at our Good Friday service, you know that's an allusion to Psalm 22. Rabbis would do this all the time. They quote the beginning of a teaching, and they just expect their audience to know their Bible so well that they go, oh, yeah, I know. So he quotes Psalm 22, and then all of Psalm 22 should come to mind. If you read the rest of Psalm 22, it's eerie how much it resembles Jesus' death. There's about 17 descriptions of Jesus' death in Psalm 22, which was written hundreds of years before Jesus was born by King David. Some of these seem to apply to David as well. Certainly, if you're taking like a very poetic stance, they could apply to David, but some of them just don't make sense. Like, part of the psalm is about the author or the subject of the psalm dying, actually being executed in front of like an angry crowd. David died peacefully in his bed. For that matter, when he was writing Psalm 22, he was still alive because he was writing it. We have all these points of agreement, all these points that describe Jesus' death. He was rejected by the people. He was always faithful to God. There were powerful people arrayed against him. A little bit further on, that he dies, that people gamble for his clothing, that his hand and feet are pierced. Even the method of death is described, that his bones are put out of joint, which is consistent with a crucifixion. It would pop your shoulders out of socket so you couldn't pull yourself up to breathe. That Gentiles will worship Yahweh because of his life, death, and death and God's deliverance of him. And that's not true of David. They had David's story for hundreds of years, and there still wasn't very many Gentiles worshiping Yahweh. But when Jesus dies, within a generation, there are thousands of Gentiles, maybe tens of thousands of Gentiles, worshiping the God of Israel. So Psalm 22 about David, to an extent, it is. But this description applies perfectly to Jesus' life. And it was written hundreds of years before Jesus was born, before he died. And it makes some fantastic claims. Now, if you want to dig more into this, there's this awesome video by a guy named Mike Winger, or if you Google his name, Mike Winger, or if you Google Bible Thinker and Psalm 22, it should pull up the video. It's like an hour and a half long, but it's amazing. He goes into a lot of detail. I highly recommend checking out, because there's a lot of nuance you want to get into here. There's a lot of arguments people levy against this, but they all fall flat, and he walks through that really, really well. The point is, there are passages in the scriptures that we can point to where it is clear that there's something supernatural going on, where there's a miracle we have a lot of evidence for, or where there's a prophecy that we have every reason to believe came true. And if that's the case,